Good evening, Internet, and welcome once again to the Gospel Story. Hi, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Nelson Fernandez. I'm one of the associate pastors at Miami Temple here at church in South Florida, beautiful South Florida, and you are watching episode 1 of the Gospel Story, season 2. If you are joining us for the first time, this is a series where we look at different aspects of the Bible, but actually through the lens of story. Last season, which we finished in January, we were looking at the book of Genesis, and we looked at the beginning of obviously the book until about the story of Abraham in Genesis chapter 20 something. But this season, this is a brand new season. We are actually going to be looking at dedicating this exclusively to the book of Luke. Now, the book of Luke is one of the 4 main gospels in the Bible. It is one of the most kind of the most documented one. And this is the thing, we're looking, the reason we call this a gospel story is because many people have studied and read about the gospel or read the Bible, and your experience might be different than ours. You may be someone that is watching this, maybe you're one of our members and you're watching this during the time that usually is associated to prayer meeting, or maybe you're just watching this because you're scrolling through Facebook and through Twitter and through YouTube or Facebook, whatever, and you happen to stumble across this. You may have had an experience with religion and the Bible, and it's been used as a tool, as a weapon, as lots of different things. But what we want to try to do in this series is to kind of break down all of the stories that we've heard and try to get back to the crux of what is it that the text is saying and what does it have to teach us in today's lesson, today's world. Now, when we did season 1, there was not a actually there was a pandemic. The years are blurring together. It was a very different world when we did this last time. I think we were still in the middle of the worst of the pandemic, but one of the things that we're doing now with season 2 is that rather than just looking at the story from just saying, hey, this is Genesis or Luke 1, what do you think about it? What we want to look at is actually see each lesson through this lens of a theme. What we've realized is that we're going to be looking at some of the major stories of Jesus's experience in the book of Luke. And what we noticed that every book actually has, or every chapter within the book actually has a theme, if you will, to everything. And so today we're looking at Luke chapter 1. And we're not going to read it. If you want to do it a little bit later on, that's great. But we've already read it. And so the idea is that for next week, you will read the second chapter, which we'll get to later on. But I want to actually introduce to you two of our co-hosts that are going to be joining us today. We usually have a panel discussion when we're doing this, and it's going to vary week to week. I'm going to be usually one of your main presenters, but joining me, we usually have none other than some of our best pastors. We have Pastor Brian Seawall on the mic. How you doing, Brian?
Hey, very, very good. Very good. How are you, man?
Good, man. How you feeling?
It's good. I'm feeling a lot better. Not the best, couple of days, but it's never happened to me before. So that's the first for me.
Okay.
Lesson learned. Yeah.
There you go. For those of you that don't know, can I share?
Yeah.
I mean, my brother got sick on some either coffee or food poisoning or something. I don't know, but it's unpleasant. It's still unpleasant. Glad to have you with us, Brian. You have to have it. And we have no. Oh, wait. I had to drop that down. I always have to mention he always is going to have some mate with him.
Oh, yeah. I'm feeling 100%, man. I'm feeling 100% right now with this mate. I am good.
There you go, man. You're good, ready to go. And the third person, you say the Trinity or whatever. Here's Lafitte Cortez, our senior pastor, coming here together. How are you, man?
I'm good. And it wasn't the coffee because he doesn't drink coffee.
That's right.
What did you eat that you got food poisoning?
I don't know, man. It was this like weird little mesh of things that I never tried before, and we're a new place, so I tried, and I guess the peppers and the oils didn't sit too well. So yeah. Well, everything else was great though. Everything else was phenomenal.
Dope. There you go. Well, check it out. One thing we want to do with you guys that are at home is we're going to be discussing a theme of this chapter. And the chapter that we're looking at is, again, Luke chapter 1. If you have any questions about Luke chapter 1, I want to encourage you guys to write your questions in the chat. If you're looking at us on Facebook or on YouTube, this is where we're streaming live tonight. And we're streaming live every week at 8 o'clock. If you have questions about the chapter that you have, you can leave them in the chat, and then at the end, if we have time, we'll try to get to them as much as we can. But the chapter today in chapter 1, we're actually looking at the theme of openness. And again, if you guys have seen, if you've read the book of Luke chapter 1, you notice that there's a few different stories that kind of take place in the same book, the same chapter. There's a story of John the Baptist, this angel shows up and sees John's father and says, "Hey, you're gonna have a baby." The guy doesn't believe it, and then he's basically mute for a few months. And then the story shifts to Mary, Jesus's mom, and this angel appeared in front of her, and same thing. Like she's like, "Oh wow, I can't believe this." And so there's back and forth things that happen. But I saw this today, guys, on TikTok, and I thought this would be very applicable if you want a summary of what this entire chapter is about. And I'm gonna share this with everybody here real quick. See what you guys think.
Here you are, baby. Fresh baked pie, just for you.
Where did you get this?
I baked it from scratch.
We don't have an oven.
God helped me.
Joseph, please. You see how that sounds, Mary?
I just,
Listen, I thought that was you for a minute.
I'm surprised most people didn't think that was me originally. And so people are like, that was great. That was great, but that was not me. I thought that was hilarious. He's like, you see how that sounds? I think this is important to mention because a lot of times we read these stories, and if you're a believer, right, if you believe in God, it's easy to kind of overlook some of this stuff. It's like, oh, this angel shows up and tells Mary, you're gonna have a baby, and then okay, cool, it's happening. And so we just talk about lack of faith or whatever. But here's the theme of this chapter really is openness, because all of a sudden these two families, Elizabeth and her husband, and Mary and her husband, their lives are completely changed because of this experience, right? Like it's night and day. Now, whatever plans they might have had has shifted, and now something completely different is happening. And so the openness of God to just, for the openness of our openness to see what God has in store is the theme of today's lesson. So Lafi and Brian, I don't know if Brian is frozen or if he's just really enjoying that mate. Tell me about what is it about this chapter that stood out to you the most?
Well, the first thing that jumped out this week, I was talking to my friend who was not a believer, and he was mentioning how God must be punishing me because nothing is going right. And so there's this thought that God punishes us when we're doing something wrong. But here in the opening chapter, it says that Zacharias and Elizabeth were blameless, and they were righteous, but they had no baby. And so here, that's the first thing that got me as we're talking about openness, right? Here you have two blameless and righteous people that are not blessed by God,
That makes sense. And by the way, one thing I want to mention is that we're not assuming that everyone here is a believer. And so that's one thing I want everyone to know and to understand as you're watching this. If this is considered usually your prayer meeting, this is not a prayer meeting anymore. Because what we usually are, we usually done this in prayer meeting where we pray or whatever, but we're now forming a discussion with people right now, especially episode 1, you're joining us. You may have no idea who we are. We're just you're joining us, and we're trying to study this together and get an idea of like where God has been working in this session together. So Brian, how's your connection? Do you want to share thoughts on this one? Test on this one. Test it.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm still frozen, but
you're not. I hear you.
So, okay, cool. So honestly, the first thing that jumps out to me is just there in verse 1, where it says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled, right? And so Luke is writing from this perspective of, hey, I'm not the only one who's writing this story, right? I'm not the only one who's writing this gospel. Many have taken unto themselves the task of writing this gospel to many other people. And so when I think of the simplicity, when I think of what the gospel is about, and when I think of, these different themes that we're going to be talking about, I'm also thinking like, man, Luke, 1, wasn't the only guy to write this, but 2, how important did a figure in the known world, right, in the ancient world back then, have to be for one account to be written of that person? How important of a historical figure would that guy had to be for, Josephus to mention him once, right? Or any of these other well-known historians to mention them once. And to know that from Luke, words, we hear that many have undertaken the task to write this. We're talking about this person, this Jesus, is a character in history that is extremely important and plays a crucial role in what history will unfold as we get through this gospel together.
Yeah, and actually, one thing that you should know for those of you that are watching this, the book of Luke is written by this guy named Luke. He was not one of the disciples. He's this guy that came later on, and he kind of started taking a lot of the stories that were kind of circulating around him at the time about like how Jesus's life was. And like Brian said, he decided to write down all of these things together so that people within the contemporary world and afterwards might have an idea of, hey, this is what's happening. This is what as best as I can corroborate, this is what actually happened according to the eyewitnesses that were there. He wrote this book and the book of Acts. So they're written by the same person. It's kind of like almost meant to be taken as one and two. But Luke writes his stuff. And one of the things that jumps out to me here in the way that I was looking at this, and Brian was 100% right in his description of Jesus being like the central figure in the ancient Near world. But one of the things that really jumped out to me as I was looking at this chapter, as you're reading it later on, is like how it's very interesting to see how different the responses were between Mary and Zachariah, her husband. So this is the same angel, right? This Gabriel that he says, hey, I've stood before God and I know what he's like. And he shows up first to this guy who is, for lack of a better word, he's like a pastor. He's a religious leader. And he's actually in the temple when he sees this vision. And he sees an angel, and it's like you'd imagine it's everything that his worldview is supposed to say is cool. Like, so he's in the temple doing his thing. All of a sudden, an angel comes. He's like, hey, I'm Gabriel. I stand at the presence of God. By the way, your wife is going to have a baby. And he's shining. He's glowing. And the thing that this dude does, he's like, yeah, but like, how I know for sure, though? Like, how do you know? Like, are you sure? And so I could just imagine like the angel being like, bro, like, you understand? Like, I stand at the, how does, am I a joke to you? You know what I'm saying? Like, just imagining this scene. But yet a little bit later, the same angel shows up before a teenager, and we don't know where she's at. She's just kind of at home. And what we're seeing is that Jesus Gabriel just shows up to the city of Galilee, just gives like this sort of tacit description of this young lady named Mary, and says, hey, listen, you're gonna have a baby. And so she's like, whoa, how do I know this to be true? Like, so she's not debating the fact that she's having a conversation with this extraterrestrial being, this angelic being. She's basically like, hold up, like, how is this for real though? Like, how do I know that this will be for sure? And so Gabriel tries as best as possible to explain how is it that that birth happens or conception happens without the male and the female. And so she's like, well, I guess okay, and just the difference in the way that each one of them were receptive to this this shift in their life was just very interesting to me, because I think in many ways when we look at ourselves through the eyes of many of these authors, we tend to compare ourselves. And in some way, that's just human nature. We tend to think, hey, how would I be if I was in that situation? And what we find is that one person was super open to this shift. And this was this young girl who says, I'm okay, I'm going to be the mother to like the Messiah. She's open. But yet this other person who you would assume would already know and be prepared and be ready for this and be open to this person was not. Instead, he was like, nah, I don't know. Are you sure? Is this kind of like, how do I know? Even though he was in the presence of, like I said, an angelic being. So people respond in some ways to revelations of like what will happen or what's going to happen many different ways. And I don't think it's, just because you've been in a community, say like church, doesn't mean that you will be just as easy, or like you will accept truth or a new revelation easier than those who are outside. It might be that sometimes the things that are inside the community are there's almost like we build a wall of prejudice against new revelations, against new things, because we think, wait, hold up, how do we know that's going to happen for sure? Mm-hmm. So that's what jumps out to me. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that, guys? Okay. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna just round robin this now. I want to ask you guys a couple of questions, and if you guys are watching this, this is something for you guys to think about as well. The theme today is openness, and how each of these characters were open to God's leading. So for us, I want us to tell us about a situation where you, Brian, or you, Lafitte, might have been faced with sudden, unexpected news, just like Mary and Zachariah were. How did you guys take it?
Well, I'll start. My wife was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis a couple of years ago, and that we're still stunned. We're still shocked because all our lives she has served the church. She has done so many things. Health message, etc., etc. And all of a sudden now she has this neurological disease. And the one thing that my wife is a trooper, Brian and Nelson, you both know her. One thing that I see in her is that she took the attitude of Mary, where Mary said, "Let it be to me according to your word." It's not like she's jumping for joy that she has MS, but she's like, okay, if this is what's coming my way, then I'm going to deal with it. And so she's a fighter. That hasn't stopped her from working. She still does everything that she does, even though she got infected with COVID, which it flared up her MS this last year. But she is a trooper. And so that's our experience of receiving news that unexpected.
Yeah, I think that it's hard for me to maybe put a finger on it. There has been moments of illness in my family, particularly on my mom's side of the family, where moments seem dire, and you have to pivot quickly in order to either get those last conversations across, or educate the best you can before you think you might not see that person again. So those moments of loss are very difficult and really push you to make changes. But for the sake of, I guess, sounding corny to this question, maybe lining it up a little bit, I gotta say, when I found out I was coming to Miami Temple, I think that was a moment where I wasn't expecting it. I definitely wasn't expecting it like at all. And I think that throughout my life, my parents have done a really great job at just not just roll with the punches, but kind of like being able to stand firm and walk through and do the best you can, even though the circumstances or the hand that has been dealt to you hasn't been of the best. And so I think that throughout my life, I was able to do that because of the parents that I have, and the support system I've had with my family. But when it came to making that move to Miami Temple, it was relatively new. I had no idea where I heard of Miami Temple. And so it was difficult, but I was blessed with having a close circle of pastors who were able to guide me as soon as I got here. And before I even got to know the church, I was already having conversations with different people about where I was going. And I think that that's key, Nelson, the fact that Mary, as soon as that happened to her, she was able to run to someone to ask questions, to say, "Hey, Elizabeth, how does this feel? What should I be doing? How can I be prepared? How can I start the ground running?" I think that I was blessed with the fact that in that transition of my life, I was able to have a group of people that were, had my back. So I think that that's what I can pull out from the story, particularly when Mary goes to see Elizabeth.
Yeah, no, I hear that. One of the things I think that I think of when I'm thinking about this story is this was supposed to be a very happy occasion, but if you start putting two and two together, especially that TikTok video I shared with you guys, is that even though this was supposed to be a happy occasion, it came with baggage, especially for Mary, because she was already engaged to somebody. And I think about, the news of babies. For me, it was a few different ways. I remember when we have two kids, and back in 2015, back when my wife told me she was expecting our first, I remember I had just came back from a conference, from a meeting in Washington D.C., and she surprised me with a game, with a pregnancy test inside, and I was like I remember, like, my blood flowed from my head. I was like oh my gosh, I can't believe. And most people know me as someone who loves to talk, but I had no words at that time. I was like, are you for
What
real?
game is that, man? What game is that?
It was a game called Kingdom Hearts. So back in the day, it was like a Disney game, and I'm like, oh my goodness, like, but I forgot about the game. Like, I was like, because this is something way more important than the game. But I was like, I had no words, and I was just like in shock, you know. And I sometimes put myself in the shoes of Zechariah, and I wonder if maybe that's the shock, that maybe he didn't consciously was like, oh, how am I gonna believe this? Maybe he was just in such in shock that he was like, how do I know? You say stupid things when you're in shock, and this was this is a very stupid thing. He did that, but I also I remember, we suffered a miscarriage between our first child and our second child, and I remember that, when my wife said she was pregnant the second time, and then when the pregnancy was a few weeks in, and then she felt something wasn't right. We went to the hospital. We were coming back from a weekend in Orlando, and then when we got the news that the baby wasn't going to be viable, and that the body was in the process of aborting the baby. It was almost like a numb reality. We were kind of numb, and that was like a time bomb that was for us. We had been expecting this baby, and then it wasn't there, and the process of working through that pain took a long time. It wasn't something that we were just like, oh, okay. Like, I honestly didn't even grieve that as a loss until later on, and then when I hit it, it hit like a wall. It hit really hard, and just that news was unexpected. These are two instances of, both of these cases again were kids, and you respond in different ways. Sometimes it's joy, and other times it's joy, and then you just kind of grieve. And I think we all sometimes have these moments of joy and celebration and sadness. Some things we expect, but the moments where we don't expect something to happen, these are the moments that really kind of make us pause and try to think about, hey, how do we deal with these unexpectedness parts of things? And how do we respond to how do we become open, to increase our openness to these unexpected events of life? And these were two unexpected events that we had here. We're checking here the comments, and one of our friends, Brandon, was saying, I I understand. He says, honestly, when Maria found out, I'll put this on the screen here. A friend of ours, Brandon, he's like, honestly, when Maria found out she was pregnant with Eric, that's her oldest, I was scared. I wasn't sure how we would be able to afford a baby. Man, listen, I understand. At that time, we were what they call dinks. We were double income, no kids. And so part of it, maybe after I got over the shock, was like, what? We're not going to be able to like enjoy this on ourselves now in some ways. But yeah, certainly, like, that's just a huge change of pace, and now, we're very excited. We have two. The house is very, very busy, and God is taking care of us. So let me ask you guys this question here. I know each of you guys have shared experiences of how you had new experiences. You had new, you could say you had new moments in life, new realities you had to contend with. And Brian, you came to Miami, and Lafi, you shared your wife's experiences of having MS. What do you think, as I've thought about some of the ways that you responded, what are some some things that prevent us or impede us from being open to these new experiences. Like I know that whenever we face something that we expect, it's easy to jump at it, be like, okay, cool. But what do you think it is about maybe your case or maybe humans that sometimes makes us have pause whenever we find these new moments of hey, new revelations or this new thing's going to happen? Like, what is it that keeps us from being willing to engage and be open to these things as openly, if you will, maybe as Mary was, as she got the news from the angel?
I think for me, it's lack of control. Here's a situation that now I have no control over. I can't do anything about this. And many times we resist anything new because one, we think that we're going to lose control. And of course, we're afraid. We're afraid, and that cripples us, paralyzes us.
Yeah,
So that's-
I can see that. Part of me, I think, when I think about this, you're right about the lack or the fear of losing control. I think when I look at that, that's the best thing I can think about. I'm someone that likes to have plans of, we're gonna do this here, and we're gonna plan this here, and it's okay if I'm going from point A to point B, and there's something that happens, and I'm like, okay, I have to veer this off, but I'll still eventually get there, right? But when something happens that we really don't expect and that now is out of our control, like you said, like that's something that just messes you up. And the fear of like, I can't control this, I can't fix this.
yeah. Because we had plans for retirement. We knew we wanted to do this, we want to do that, but this is a neurological disease, and probably should be in a wheelchair, paralyzed. And so then now it's like, okay, I didn't want this to happen. Why is this happening? And why is this happening to her? Why not to me?
Yeah, a lot of times you put yourself in a situation where you could stop. If you could stop the pain, if you could stop these things from happening, you probably would. Brian, you were going to say something.
Oh man, did I freeze again?
A little bit.
You're good.
All right, cool. So I think it for me, it comes down to expectations in people, not expectations in people, expectations, people, in the sense that when it comes to you making a new move, you always tend to build up these expectations of either what you're expecting from the move you're making or what you're expecting like in return, right? And so when I think of expectations and when I think about moving to a new place, sometimes we're expecting that move to happen in order for us to experience the newness, right? And I think that especially young people, I think we're prone to wanting to wander off into new experiences, into new places, because we don't know how to experience newness where we are. And I think that is something key when it comes to expectations and moving forward or moving to something new, is realizing the fact that aside from the things that perhaps you're used to seeing or you're used to kind of interact with the same people, aside from those things, there are things yet for you to see that you have not seen. And I think it takes like maybe some kind of maturity to be able to get to a place where you see those things happening. But secondly, I say people because first impressions do count. And I think that your first impression coming into a new place will determine whether that move, that pivot that you've made, whether that's been something that, oh man, this is great, it's going to go amazing from here, or it's going to maybe deter you and say like, wow, why did I make this choice? And so a lot of times people have that big role to play in our decisions, where we see the outcome of our decisions, whether they were something that is going to benefit us or something that we are more likely to fear from forth, And so I think that if you get that first impression from people, that it's critical, along with, actually dialing in on your expectations and making sure that those are really something that you truly want and that's going to bring value to your life.
Yeah, that's actually great. One thing that I thought of when you were saying all that is this idea of unresolved tension. Whenever I think of, you know, my experience, and yours experience as well, is this idea of unresolved tension. And that's also what we seem to have in this chapter. At least starts off in this chapter, because what we have is where there's now tension. And yeah, there's happiness whenever there's a child. But if you look at the story of John the Baptist, he was like, hey, he's gonna be kind of nuts. He's gonna be out in the desert and he's gonna eat honey and locusts and kind of a wild child. And then here the Messiah is coming in, and you know, he's gonna be called Jesus. And you know, there was all the stories that we know about Jesus, and even back then there was lots of conceptions of what the Messiah would be like and how he would be, and that inevitably led to tension all throughout Jesus's life and also in John the Baptist's life. And so you see some of this tension arrive even in John's own story as he was looking in the story of Jesus, and we'll see this later on in the book. But whenever new things happen in our lives, it opens a door to maybe unresolved tension and us not having all the answers. And so whenever we look at, you know, you don't just look at, you know, our own stories. If we look at the way that we, as a society, as a world, operate, many times I think when we look at the way people interact with each other, or lack thereof, how they don't communicate with each other and how they don't talk, and how there seems to be a surge in tribalism, not only in our country but around the world, I think a lot of it stems from fear. This unresolved tension that exists, feeling that, hey, we don't have full control of this, we don't know these things, and what, you know, that again goes back to that uncertainty. Like Brian said, like if we're not open to new experiences and learn how to live within the tension, then you know it's easy to stay within the circle of comfort, you know, and not step outside of that. And sometimes when we make a calculated choice to come to a new place, it's okay, but it's especially hard if you're in here in the new place and you're like, hold up, what about, and this is something that I've had before, where you know you sometimes think, hey, this is God's will, we're here, and then something happens, and it's like, oh my goodness, like I thought this was God's will. Maybe at a situation where you're like, I thought this was maybe what God wanted, and then all these terrible things happen. Like, is this still God's will?
Yeah.
Right? And sometimes living within that unresolved tension is what makes openness to new things so hard, because it's like you almost don't want to step into the newness, because like, okay, what is going to be over there? Brene Brown calls sometimes this apprehension that we have to try new experiences, where we kind of think about everything that could go wrong. She calls this dress rehearsing tragedy. And so I think that at least I tend to do that a lot, thinking about, okay, what's going to go wrong here? How can I work against it? I have all these different scenarios where I think if we just start thinking about all these scenarios where it can go wrong, we don't allow ourselves to live in the moment and to think about, hey, this is what God is doing right in my life. And so, yeah, it makes it hard, man. Some thoughts here that have come in here from Brandon. Brandon is the one I got to say today, the MVP today seems to be Brandon Mowry, with his thoughts. I know there's people watching. You guys are kind of silent. That's okay. You know, we want to encourage you guys to converse, though. We listen. Last season was phenomenal because we got to build a community of people. So as the time goes on, you'll get more comfortable with us. But I hope you interact with us, because we love to hear from you guys and hear and see who's watching us. Brandon says for him, for me, it's hard to trust completely in God and his plan. I want to know how something is going to happen, and it's hard for me to put myself completely in God's hands. And next thing he says, I think it's interesting that both Zechariah and Mary questioned the angel as to how the baby is going to come about. Zechariah is punished, but Mary isn't.
And you know, I can relate, because I'm the pastor, right? I'm the one who, many years in ministry, I've seen God's hand in different situations. So when the news of the MS, Linda's the one that was Mary. She's like, okay, listen, let God's will be done. And I was a Zacharias. Like, I was the one that's frustrated and angry, and why is this happening? And I think not so much that Zechariah was punished, is, you know, with great power comes great responsibility, right? So you're the priest, right? You're in the holy place. Gabriel is speaking to you, and you have the audacity to doubt. You should know better. Just like I should know better. I should trust that God is going to work in this situation. Because here's what I've learned. Whenever something happens in our lives, for those of us who are Jesus followers, Jesus is trying to perfect our character, because the ultimate goal of Christianity is to be like Jesus. And so sometimes these trials come about, not sometimes, these trials come up because God is trying to do something so that we can truly trust him in all areas of our lives. Many of us, Jesus followers, just trust him in the spiritual area. We compartmentalize that, but we don't trust him in the other areas of our lives. So my wife and I, this is a journey that we're taking, that, okay, we're going to trust him in this area, in her health.
That's powerful. I think you're right. It's yeah, it's crazy. I think Brian is in and out.
He's back. He's back.
Is he back?
It's food poisoning. Maybe he,
It sounds like his computer got food poisoning too. It's it's in and out. Something we're going to share here from Brandon right now. Brandon seems to be like really sharing his thoughts here as well. Is that he said, and Brian, get your thought ready here. I'll come to you in a second. He says, the thought that occurs right now is that sometimes it's easier to accept something challenging happening to us rather than watching it happen to someone we love.
True. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that. One of the things that I think about is, I think it's, I can see how he should have known better. I put myself in that situation too. And Mary was younger. I mean, Zechariah was an older guy.
Yeah. And he knew the story of Abraham, right?
Yeah, I can see that. And then Mary, by all accounts, by the way, most people, the way that they depict Mary is, this 20-something, 30-something-year-old. Chance that she might have been early 20s, if not younger. Back in those days, women used to have children, start having kids in their teens, late teens. And so she might have been a teenager in this time. So yeah, I can see that. But I remember I've known that it doesn't mean that young people are more open to new experiences, but I will say that it might be in some ways easier because there is, when you're younger, this willingness to try new things and to explore new things. And then when we're older, and I'll count myself in that. I'm 35 this year, and I already feel like, man, there's some things that I like. I like my vanilla ice cream. I'm not gonna switch to something different now. Something like that. It's something small. Imagine when you get older, you're like, oh, this is the way it is.
Yeah, and Nelson, the older we get, sometimes we also get jaded, right? You have a young person that has that faith, that first love for Christ. And for many of us who've seen life, like, yeah, okay, yeah, we've seen this movie before.
Mm-hmm. I can actually, I can attest to that. I know that experience, that feeling. Brian, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Thoughts?
On openness and young people?
No. Yeah, if you had anything so far, if not, we're going to jump to the next question here. We have one more question before we finish.
No, I mean, I liked everything you've mentioned so far. I do. I would say that sometimes when it comes to young people being open, we want to be open. Like there's one of the latest research is talking about like the new generation, Gen Z, which isn't really the new generation, it's the current generation. But we talk about Gen Zers and saying like, oh, they're really technologically savvy, this and that and the other. At the end of the day, really what they want, according to the research, is they want to be able to communicate face to face. And what happens many times is that I feel that the church is the best breeding ground for like the worst things that can happen. And what I mean by that is like we have like the best place for openness to actually genuinely happen. And yet the way that we go about interpreting theology sometimes closes us off to those things. And so many times we believe that having a straight, narrow doctrine supersedes that of having a real open community. And so I think that when it came to like Jesus, I felt like most times, especially now here in the Gospel of Luke, we'll see this a lot. Jesus really cares about making every way possible, like the making the way that everyone can kind of come in, everyone can be a part, that all can be a part, not just those who are doctrinally safe. And so when I think of openness and when I think of young people, I think that one, we love face-to-face time, but two, it also comes to a point where we are more willing to bend around certain things that, like for instance, dress code. We're willing to bend around certain things like dress code for the sake of inclusivity and for the sake of unity and for the sake of having someone be involved in service. And I think that that's kind of like what I think of when I think of openness, is being able to look over the things that are our preference, just the things that God wants. And sometimes we become closed off because we're focused on what we want, according to Scripture, what we want, and we're not really open to having those honest, genuine relationships with people. That it's not about what you want, it's about what they need, and what we need is friendship. What we need is relationship.
It goes back to control, right? I'm afraid that if I embrace this, I'm going to lose control. I'm going to lose control.
You're leading into the third question today. That actually is a great segue. What, if anything, you think might help individuals like us, or the people that are watching this, to expand their ability to be open, to experience God, the openness to realities in life? Is there anything that is that something I know you just said this, Lafitte, control. So that's a problem that it might impede our ability to control our openness to God. But is there something that we can do to become more open to the new realities of the world and whatnot?
Yeah. Well, for me, the first thing is to remember that God loves us. That even though there's a situation that's happening, like my wife has MS, that doesn't mean that God stopped loving her. God stopped loving us. And I just have to trust that love. I need to embrace that. So that's for me. That's the first thing. This whole experience, I have to remind myself, God is not punishing me. That's why, Zachariah and Elizabeth, they were blameless. They were righteous. God was not punishing them. And so God is not punishing my wife and myself, my family.
And especially looking at that story right now, it's easy to think, oh, well, Zachariah lost his ability to speak, so isn't that in some ways like a punishment? Well, in some ways, you could see it that way. Another way to see it might also be that, one of the things that came up after he lost his like the moment that he was able to speak again, the moment that, like, how he gained his voice back was almost as big of a story as how he lost it in the first place. And so it turned into like a testimony for it to be like, yeah, his name is John.
That's right.
And that was the first thing he said. So he was able to kind of tell others, hey, listen, this is how I lost my voice. Because again, people didn't know what happened. He tried to gesture, explain, but it wasn't until he got his voice back, he was able to say, okay, this is what happened. And amazing. So in the same thing that I think when we're living with our challenges, when we think about things that might be punishment in the long run, might turn into ways and testimonies that we might be able to influence others and say, hey, I've gone through something similar, or I've gone through pain, I've experienced this, I've learned how to live with the tension in dealing with this openness. For me, I think when I think about how to become more resilient in being open to God's leading, I think it's always been expanding my circle. When I connect with other people that are outside of my church community, I feel great. Friday nights, I have like a meeting with some of my friends, old friends that we've had a long time, and just being able to meet with them is a very good, especially in the pandemic where we haven't been able to meet in person, has been a good oasis. But beyond that, I think interacting with people that are outside of my faith is another great way to do things. I think maybe this is just the evangelism pastor in me out speaking as outreach, right? But I think that you really limit your ability to understand what other people think if you're just sticking with your own people all the time, right? So if you're like, hey, we're supposed to reach the world, and you're only hanging out like with only Christians, or even beyond that, like within only just your denomination, how are you supposed to reach everybody else if you're just like in the water with all the same fish, right? And it doesn't mean that you have to force and control them, but certainly by interacting with others. And by the way, the book of Luke is one of the biggest books that talks about the challenges that the Jewish leaders had in realizing they had to expand their community to the Gentiles and beyond that. There was kind of an apprehension back then for not only the people in Jesus's immediate life, but after it, where the disciples came by, to really recognize, well, does God work with more people than just the Jews? That was one of the lingering questions. And as we're going to see, God was like, yes, God works with a bunch of people who you might not realize. And for us, it's not just being open to God's leading in our life, but recognizing and being open to possibly God's leading in other people's lives beyond what we consider appropriate. Like God couldn't possibly work with those people. You know what I'm saying? But the openness that we're referring to now is not just being open in your life, but recognizing that we have to be open to God's leading in other people's life. And that's what we're going to see as well. So interacting with others, I think, is a huge part.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just to add on to what you guys said, which was phenomenal. You have different instances in this chapter where it said, look, they were filled with the Holy Spirit. So you have like Mary, right? You have a baby. You have the mother of John. I forget her name right now. Elizabeth.
Right.
You have Zachariah. They're all being filled with the Holy Spirit. And what you see there is that they're being filled with the Holy Spirit because they have become open to God's moving in their lives. Even though for Zachariah, you kind of twists his arm a little bit, like he gets mute and all this other stuff, and eventually, right, he has a beautiful song that he sings. But in a way, he, every time that the Spirit happens to be involved in this particular part of the story, it's always with people being open to the moving of God. And why wouldn't they be? When you look at the entire story, you see that God is continually open to his creation, to his people, even when we don't deserve it. And we're like, oh man, what kind of crazy love is this, man? He's so reckless. Like, how's he gonna love these people? How's he gonna cure such and such person? And you see that God's continually open to his people, even when it seems like it doesn't make any sense, even when it seems like, okay, no, you went too far, to the left on that one, Jesus. He still does all these things. And what I want to kind of bring out is something that Nelson already mentioned, and it's this fact of like, when it becomes difficult for us to continue to provide a space for our young people to worship and come together when they're the only ones acting like disciples and missionaries. Because when we don't expose ourselves to people from the world, right, when we don't expose ourselves to have relationships with people outside of the church, then who becomes the more Am I back?
You're back. Becoming the more. You're there.
Yeah, my bad.
You're good.
Dang. Yeah, my Wi-Fi today is acting up. When it comes to like actually being a missionary, right? Like Nelson was talking about, it comes down to the person who is most exposed to large group of people, to several denominations, to several different groups of people. And I think many times in church we don't do that, right? We just kind of like keep to our own, and in a way that makes us just not the best people to minister to our youth, because they have been exposed and we haven't. So we're trying to come and bring them into this little box. We should be the ones, like Nelson said, to go out, speak to people that aren't within our Christian circles, to be able to be better educated at what life is like outside of our bubble of Christianity. And I think that our young people are exposed to that for a much longer time than we are. And that's why when it gets to the older ages, we're like, man, how do we get our young people involved? Well, you need to change your mindset. That's the first step.
I think that some of us are wrestling with this tonight. And again, I think when we look at tonight, I don't want us to simply just have things settled in a nice little bow. It might not answer everything, but we want to start opening your mind, if you will, to allow you to rest and sit with this like uncomfortableness of scripture. Again, I think we do a disservice to people that come to the Bible and to come to religion and to think that here you're going to find all the answers, right, to everything, and everything's going to make sense and nothing's going to not make sense and everything's going to be fine, hunky-dory. And if you have any questions, you just need to go back to the Bible or you need to read harder, because if you still have questions after reading this, then something's wrong with you. That's not I hope that's not the conclusion that we're giving you. And I think that once we're looking at especially this chapter, it leaves us with a few questions. One, how open are we to God's revelation in our life? Two, like, what is it that's keeping us from being open to these things? I know that Mary just said here, I think many of us want openness, but we also want control. So we might want for God to reveal himself and do his will in our lives, but we're also scared where that might lead us, or what that might cost us, right? So there's a truth in that. I think Elie Honore says here, leaving unconditionally the control issue to God, like Mary accepting God's will no matter how humanly messy it's going to be. I think that's a great way to describe it. No matter how humanly messy it might be, especially in Mary's case, man, it got humanly messy. That's a scary thing. That's a scary thought. But learning how to live with this tension, I think, is part of what we got to learn to do. But recognizing that we're not just dealing with this alone. I think, like, if we were just looking at these individual players that went through this whole thing and thinking they just dealt with it in isolation, that would be one thing. But if we remember that they were part of God's larger plan, or remember part of the gospel story, it's easier to recognize when there's some challenges in our life. And just like them, you're also part of the story too. You're part of the gospel story, as we're all working together, like recognizing that we are all players within this large tapestry of good news that God is weaving across the universe to bring ultimately people back to redemption with him. And so that's part of where we need to remember. This is where we have time for maybe one or two questions here. We're going to answer one for now. Here we have Maria asking questions. I'm wondering, why was Mary chosen above all other young girls? What made her different? Like, why? We don't have a whole bunch of information here. Mary's like, hey, why am I so special? Like that God would choose me to bear, bear my Lord. What do you think, though, Afil, as you're seeing?
I think the answer that she gave, let it be to me according to your word, her faithfulness, her humility could be part of the reason why she was chosen.
Yeah.
There's nothing else in scripture that tells us.
Context, she's like, I know growing up, she was saying that we were always pointed to Mary, like, what should we be like? Yeah, I never could be like that, no matter how much I aspired to be. Yeah, I get it, because I think Honore mentions here, it was grace. It was grace. I think God knowing the heart of all things, he might have known that she might have been willing. But I think this is something I'll be talking about on Saturday. By the way, if you're watching this, this is this is the week after Easter, and so today is the 7th.
7th.
So this Saturday I'll be talking about that. This will be for the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th. I think it'll be the 10th of February. If you want to watch that sermon, I'll be April, the 10th of April. I'm calling it the hero is Jesus. A lot of times I think we make that mistake when we look at characters in the Bible and we say we need to be like them. Even Mary and even John. You're going to see Mary and John. These were, as we're reading through the book, these are people who Jesus says about John, there hasn't and will never be another man born of a woman like John.
John the Baptist.
John the Baptist, by the way. Yeah, John the Baptist. He's like, this guy is the best out of all you suckers. Everybody, he's the best. But if you look at John, John near the end was like, listen,
Well,
I'm not sure about you, Jesus. Like, are you the right guy? Like, he was really doubting. But I think that the part of the mistake is when we look at the story of the Bible and see all of the people in the Bible as like our heroes, or as our, like, you know, we need to measure up to them as if there was something that they had that we don't, because then that creates a comparison effect where we don't have it no matter how much we try, right? Like Mary, we'll never get there. And so that leads to failure. That leads to, well, I'm never going to get there. Like, you know, why keep trying? And the reality is, I think a lot of people look at church and religion and have that concept of like, well, these are the people that have it all together. And I'm not going to be at church until I have my whole act together.
yeah.
They do it a lot, but that's not understanding the gospel story. Recognizing that none of these people are heroes. They're all examples, and they're just as flawed human beings, if
Correct.
not more than you and I.
Correct.
Mary was a good woman. Like, I'm not saying that she wasn't. You can't trash somebody, but
No.
just like every person, everybody is like a web of things that you can say are really good with that person. Things are like, maybe that person's not the best in these areas, and that's okay, because we're all fallen human beings. For more on that, see season 1.
Yeah.
We talked all about that.
But Nelson, we all have our ups and downs in the journey.
Mm-hmm.
Mary, this was a high point in her walk with God.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we'll see later on in her story, you know, she wasn't perfect. She had her issues.
A low point, yeah. But you know, I think I like Honore's thought that I think being grace, you know, in some ways, like, why is it that she would be chosen? In some ways, like, why did God do any of this stuff? Like, a lot of it must be grace. And for more on that, we'll have to unpack that a little bit later, because the whole concept of grace is pretty big. We'll jump into it more this season. So as we leave, any closing thoughts, Lafitte, before we finish up tonight?
Well, for me, I want to have the faith of Mary, because the faith of Mary is what I'm seeing in my wife. So I'm gonna brag on my wife, because not once in the time that she has been diagnosed with MS has she said, "Why me?" She hasn't displayed anger towards God. She's like, you know what? Let it be to me according to your word. And so she has been the one that's teaching me about faith. I've been the Zechariah at home.
Man, sometimes I'm like, maybe God needs to do the same thing with me. Just shut me up, because that's why I'll be I'll be better just being quiet. But one of the things that I think about is I think I need to learn how to live with this tension, like live with the tension of God's will in my life. As God is unfolding his work in my life, I'm going to be living in some very uncomfortable moments where things in my life, things in my family, things in my finances may not be the way I want them to be, right? But it still doesn't mean, like you said, that I'm out of God's plan, that this isn't what God has, that, you know, somehow God has forgotten about us. Like, this is just part of life, and learning how to roll with the punches, being open to life, and learning how to live with the tension is part of what I think I need to wrestle with. I hope all of us are learning how to do with it. And if we're comfortable, then I think life will have a way of moving us outside of our comfort zone, either by choice or by circumstance. So to be ready, because, you know, as long as there's life, there will be change, and everything changes. Nothing stays the same forever. So Brian had to drop out, but Lafitte, I will say adieu to you. I'll see you next week, man. Thanks for joining us.
God bless you.
Take it easy, man. And for you guys, I will say thank you for joining us for episode 1 of the Gospel Story. For next week, we're going to be looking at chapter 2 of the book of Luke. So do yourself a favor, and before we come together next week, do us a favor and read that. So if this has been a blessing to you, if you've enjoyed this conversation, I want you to do 2 things. Like this video and share it with others. It only takes a couple of seconds, but that's what helps the algorithm to get going. That way we can increase the viewership and be a resource to other people. Join us at miamitemple.org for more information on our weekly services and when we'll be airing chapter 2. Subscribe to our YouTube video and our Facebook if you want more updates on what's going on. You can see Pastor Lafitte's thoughts from a yellow chair, see my sermon on Saturday. It'll be so great. But tonight I just want to close with a word of prayer for you and your family, and whatever you're going through, whether or not you're watching us live or whether you're watching the replay. I want to pray with you tonight. Let's pray. Father, I want to thank you for this time you've given us, for allowing us to have this conversation about being open to new realities. I ask that you help everyone here as they have been watching either live or in the replay, and whatever issues they may be going through. Help them, Lord, to understand that everything they go through, it's not simply just because of, randomness, but everything has the opportunity to grow us. And it's all about how we respond to the various issues that determines how we move about and how we respond in life. So help everyone to have faith, to have resilience, to be flexible in the things that they experience, and open to the experiences and the thoughts and opinions of others, so that they can grow and they can be better leaders in wherever sector they are in. So bless us for the wonderful rest of this time and this day, wherever they're watching. This is our prayer in your name. Amen. So again, I want to say thank you for joining us today. We hope to see you guys next week on the Gospel Story. And again, we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 2. Read it. We'll see you guys then. Bye-bye.